Hello, welcome. We're in day 3 of the New Voices Festival, our 10th anniversary. I'm Chris Holmes. I'm the chair of the Department of Literatures in English, and I'm thrilled to introduce our second panel of the day, which has a wonderful title, Drama Queens, Final Girls, and Femme Fatales. You will see soon how all of these things intersect in interesting and textured ways in the work of our authors here today. We're lucky enough to have a moderator from our department, Professor Kasia Bartoszynska. Who's going to be taking our 4 writers on a trip through this topic. But thank you very much for being here, and I hope you enjoy. Please remember that there are a couple more fantastic events later on today. We have a reading in the same room at 5 p.m., and that's followed by a staged reading of our playwright's play, Dr. Ride's American Beach House, at the Cherry Arts, which is downtown, very easy to find. It's just sort of behind Wegmans on Cherry Street. So keep those in mind and take it away, Kasia.
Thank you. Is this working? Not sure now. How do I make it work? Oh, how about now? Okay. Hi, everyone. So our title, as Chris mentioned, Drama Queens, Femme Fatales, and Final Girls, sort of speaks to the ways that we think about drama and gender, especially in relation to things like stock roles and cliches and tropes. And also, I think the idea of like the male gaze and how women are represented is sort of fundamentally in relation to men and as being of interest to men. The first question I wanted to ask you is sort of drawing on that, which is that so often in fiction and drama, women are supposed to be either desirable or likable. And reading all of your work, I think what's so interesting to me about it is how in different ways, all of you really play with the idea of having women characters or narrators who are not always likable. And I think even flirting at times with the idea of like, what if the reader doesn't like them? And kind of leaving space for the reader to not like them. And so I just wanted to ask as a kind of opening question if you had thoughts on that, of how you feel about writing women that maybe people don't like sometimes. I don't know if we should just go in order, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Try that. Okay, I'll just talk really loud. So in my case, I was coming to it from a nonfiction perspective, from a place of nonfiction. So I was writing what I thought was a lyric memoir, ended up selling as an essay collection. And I think if I was writing about, I was kind of like, well, if I'm going to be writing about experiences in my life, I kind of wanted all the parts. It can't just be like, oh, here are all the sad things that happened to me. Like, I'm a messy, complicated person. So to not reveal those unlikable facets of myself, or those kind of moments where I was behaving in ways that maybe they're questionable or whatever, wouldn't have really made for as compelling a book unless I was willing to peel back my own layers. But there's also the added element of my collection of exploring the trope of the final girl, the one who survives, the one who lives through the end of the horror movie, which is a through line in the book. And it kind of emerged later, like pretty late stage. Another writer who looked at the collection kind of asked me, like, why didn't you bring this in sooner? And that was kind of a gift that she gave me, like a really enormous gift, because it ended up being like a big hinge for revision and kind of reaching new levels of the book and understanding. So kind of reckoning with ideas of survival and what that means in its many forms. But yeah, unlikable and all, right? Because the unlikable part should get to survive too. You can't just be totally like 100% of the time.
Yeah, I've always had a funny relationship to the idea of likability, I think. I came at writing fiction not primarily through workshops or craft where this is a term, but through reading books where I assumed it didn't matter at all whether I liked the character or not. And I also have a funny thing where I happen to like almost everybody. And my censor is really not calibrated to decide these things. And so when my first book came out, which has a lot to do with issues of gender presentation, female body image, consumerism, I drew a lot from my experiences. And I was really surprised when people would ask me, how did you decide to write this unlikable character? Because I was like, oh, okay. But in this book, knowing that that was likely to come, I really wanted to steer into it because my main character in Something New Under the Sun, or one of two main characters, is Kasia Carter, a sort of former child star with a somewhat struggling career as an adult star. Who has reached the limit, I think, of her flexibility in presenting herself as always likable, engaging, appealing, good-natured. These are some of the roles she's been asked to play, and I think in some ways performing that role saps your genuine energy for that thing that you've turned into sort of an object of craft. So that's where she is, and I think that for me, it was really liberating and fun to write a character who is no longer so concerned about how she appears and is acting more from these impulses, which I think is a sort of a beautiful way to be. It's something I always hope to unlock in myself.
Yeah, this is such an exciting question because, like Alex, I have such a complicated relationship with the idea of what likability means, of course. And when I think about the male characters I really attached to as a child in fiction, they're deeply unlikable, and that's what I like about them. And like in life, I don't like likable people, so I don't even know how to begin. Like what I mean as likable, I just I don't know what it even is, and it makes me think about like how for people who are assumed to be women, anything that they do is taken as a presumed vying for currency of likability or desirability, that these qualities are being presented or performed so as to get so as to feel desired or liked or valuable or seen at all. And so I tend to find that when I'm writing, a lot of times there just aren't even there aren't necessarily like men written into the space, but more specifically, there's no gaze that makes likability a virtue. So that might change it. And I think that it's also exciting to think about in writing characters who are femme people, to think about how there's no such thing as neutrality when we talk about women, that actually we mean that as neutrality is strangely such a narrow privileged position that the everyman is truly such a gender thing, and women, any flaw that they have traditionally is the way that they are characterized, right? Whereas men, we like them. We love Holden Caulfield. He's a monster, right? He's absolutely so fucking annoying. We love him. We love Macbeth. Like, it's so crazy. And we might even think of these dudes as like neutral in certain capacities, and like a woman who like makes a joke is funny, right? So, which is also a gift in writing or composing a femme person that the slightest thing they do is like, oh my God, it's like she's like a whole person, you know, that's dynamic. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And is this on? I don't know.
I think
Is
it is,
it? Okay. I had a very similar experience to Alex with my first book, where I wasn't thinking about that at all. This issue of likability never crossed my mind. I was just trying to write an authentic consciousness, you know, moment to moment. And I got that sort of feedback quite a lot about my protagonist, this idea of whether or not she was likable. And I thought, really? Like, is that the most interesting like way of thinking about this character? And it's something that I think comes up a lot in conversations about fictional texts by women that feature female characters as central characters. And I have to say that I was more conscious of it with this book because my main character Miranda is she is a villain. There's no question about that. You know, I'm drawing from All's Well That Ends Well, where the main character of All's Well That Ends Well is a really kind of a very polarizing figure. Helen is somebody that you either like cannot stand or you root for. And the other text that Miranda is drawing from is Macbeth. And, and I'm also drawing from Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and thinking about her. And, they're charismatic. Both of those characters, deeply charismatic, but I don't necessarily know if they're likable. But I think you have to have some degree of charisma or charm or, authentic humanity to capture a reader. Certainly that's how I'm captured. It's not a question of whether or not I like the person. Mm-hmm. It's whether or not I can inhabit their reality. I'm convinced that this is a real consciousness I'm entering. That's the trick that the fiction author has done for me, is really put me in somebody else's consciousness. That's so exciting. And then the question of likability just sort of evaporates because I'm invested. I'm inside.
Yeah, thank you. I think the idea of charisma as a kind of alternate version of what likability could be is so helpful. I think of like, why do I want to spend time with this person who I don't like, but I'm sort of fascinated by? Although I will say that I do like all of these. To be clear, I'm not saying I don't like the people in these various texts. So a sort of related question, which is about sex and bodies, in that, the sort of idea of the femme fatale is like the desirable body or the sort of appealing body. And we all know women tend to be sex objects. And I think that one way that we tend to kind of steer away from that is to turn sex into comedy and awkwardness. And then perhaps the sort of other version is like disgust or horror. And sometimes it feels like those are kind of the only three options. It's like bodies or sex can be desirable or appealing, or they can be funny, or they can be horrifying. And are there other options? Are there, or do we can we use all of those three things? What are some of the sort of challenges you face or the things you enjoy in writing about sex and bodies?
So yeah, I don't know if you want to go in.
Yeah, why don't maybe we reverse order?
Sure. Well, in this novel, it's a very interesting thing because it draws again from All's Well That Ends Well, which is about this main character Helen, who has this unrequited desire for this awful man, Bertram. And that's all she wants. I mean, she's thirsty. She really wants this guy, and you just don't even understand it because he is on stage. He's not particularly likable. He's not charismatic. So you really wonder about Helen. She's very invisible, in the play, and that interested me so much. And she turns the world of the play upside down and claims this kind of agency for herself in order to get that guy. And so, I had to reckon with that in my character, Miranda. So she is struggling with chronic pain, and she feels like her body has been medicalized past the point where she can even see herself as a sexual person. She feels like that's been erased by the way that she's being seen. She's being diminished. But she still has desire, she still has longing. And the play is about exploring that, and sort of, the book is about exploring that and sort of giving her her wish, giving her body back. And sex is a really, really important part in All's Well in the novel. It's a very important part of how she kind of reclaims her agency and her power. And I thought that was very important given the source text that I was doing. Also, it was just fun.
This feels like such a challenge of a question to me, because I feel like I write in order to pretend that I personally have no body, and do a lot of like complicated psychological work to like just not be in one. So in writing a play, right, I'm transposing my ideas about whatever it is into this most vulnerable of art form, where of course the body is the instrument, right? And the body and the voice is what we see. And I feel like there's so much responsibility in that mostly I'm not, I'm almost like thinking in the exact opposite ways of these delicious things that we think of and that we get to experience in fiction on the page, where we get to capture that body, but when I feel like it's being transposed onto a performer's body, I feel this tremendous responsibility to make sure that whatever the concepts I'm communicating that feel so disembodied can be can feel tense and sexual and horrific and absurd, without ever being dependent upon a harmful gaze. And I don't really know how to do that, but that's what I'm thinking.
This is an interesting question for me, because I had to make a decision with this novel, which I felt was so just full of stuff. It was really difficult for me to sheepdog it around. And one of the things that I thought was I was really going to excise sex in a certain way from the book. Like, there are bodies in it, and sexiness exists as sort of a quality that a photo shoot can have, or maybe a bathing suit can have, but there's nothing actually sexy going on in this world, because it's kind of a pre-apocalyptic world. It feels like we're at the end of things in a certain way. And another thing is like, it's a book sort of based in the desert and desertification and dryness, harshness. And I always think that the way sex existed in my previous book was through a sort of contamination, seepage of image onto image, seepage of desire. And, like ferns send motile sperm through like damp surfaces, like sex is damp. And here there's just none of that. So everything that happens that has a sort of root in desire just like wilts our way through. Like, there's a scene where one of my main characters, Patrick, like he sort of wants to feel something, so he tries to fantasize about Cassie, and he ends up just sort of like kissing his arm, imagining it's someone else, and it totally doesn't work. It's a dry arm, his dry lips, nothing is going on. So I think that I made that decision in part too because I wanted to, kind of put up a firewall around Cassie's own desire, what it might be, what it could be. She is just the focal point of a lot of desire, and I keep what she feels for herself.
Yeah. So when I started thinking about this book and thinking about bodies and sex and the horror genre, as the essays weave scenes and dialogue from horror films to kind of reflect on my experiences with grief, traumas of various sorts, the body, my body. And initially, I think there was a lot of fear for me, this sense that I was kind of stepping into something that historically has a genre that has not been kind to women and has actively, I think, inflicted violence and kind of cast them in these tropes and these silly little roles. And then as I was writing, there came kind of this this sense that I was tapping into, that I was kind of like owning it. And I did feel a sense of empowerment, that I was kind of encroaching on this very male space and just kind of rewriting scenes in a very poetic, beautiful, lyrical way that were historically really graphic and violent and awful, and just kind of claiming them in the context of my story, which felt kind of cool in a way, debatably so maybe, considering what some of the scenes depict, but there was something really actively satisfying about that for me. And the writing itself felt like something of the body, especially the poetic, lyrical element, and really just enjoying and leaning into the language for me, which is something that I think anytime I start to get too in my head about the ideas, I always go into like the sentence or the language, which, I don't know, maybe that's a question I could ask of myself. Is this like a, typically masculine thing? Like, oh, we just go to the craft. But for me, it was actually kind of like a lighthouse, being able to just say, we're just looking at the language, the sentences, and we're getting into that space.
This is sort of drawing on that. This is still a thought that could go in a number of different directions as far as what question would come out of it, but sort of drawing on that, I was really struck, especially in the really visual quality of all of these works. I mean, the play, of course, it's a play, like you're looking at it, but even so, there's that kind of climactic moment, somewhat literally, where there's this description of a sexual encounter, right? So it's like we're being invited to kind of look at something else happening off stage. But also in all of the other works, right, Gina, you were talking about re-narrating scenes or describing scenes, but then also, right, the opening of something new under the sun is like looking at a video or a screen, and then in All's Well, we're often like watching the character kind of watch videos of herself. So I was just really struck by the kind of intensely visual nature of all of these texts in different ways, and even with the play, right? Of just like, so there are a few different versions of a question that comes out of this, but I maybe we'll just kind of leave it up to you to answer whichever aspect of that you want about how sort of you think about visuality in the work you create, or how you think about sort of the gaze and what is shown and what is not shown. Maybe if Gina, you wouldn't mind starting?
Yeah, sure. So I came to Night Rooms with a more of a poetry heavy background. So I think for me, the image was always kind of something it's always at the center of my work for me. And I think one of my favorite parts of the book was when I said, I'm going to actually just try and remember the scenes first. And I'm writing from memory of these scenes. And it wasn't until it was like fact checking time, like, is that how that actually looked, or how that scene actually progressed, that I needed to check it. But that was really interesting to me, trying to write those from memory. And I think the more I started writing down these scenes from horror films and different moments from my life, the more I remembered, not only from the movies, but from my life. And they kind of were in that conversation together. But I think, again, it goes back to like that idea of clinging to craft as a way to kind of like, I don't know, brace myself against emotional impact when it feels a little too intense. Just leaning into the way something looked or felt or smelled. But I do rely heavily on memory for that, which is like, I feel like always a concern. Like, is this accurate? Is this how someone else saw it? And then of course comes the question of gaps and things you don't remember, or things you want to leave out because you feel like that's too personal or too private, or as you were saying, you want to kind of like pare back on the sex of Alex. That was kind of interesting, I think. But yeah, I think it raises lots of questions about what you're willing to show, what you're willing to give to an audience. But of course, you can always write something and edit it out later. So that's always something to consider.
Yeah, I've written so few novels, I always compare one to the other. But because in the first one, I used a first person voice, I didn't really have the same mobility that I found I had in the third person, which is part of why I wanted to write in the third person. I found it so fun in the third person that it felt like I had this camera, this narrative eye that could go anywhere weightlessly. And to just take it in different places and put the camera there and see what I saw was a huge part of the appeal and part of how I felt free within that work while I was working on it. And it also, I think, tied into some of the themes that I wanted to access. Things like things like the frame, for example, like that there is a frame on every photographic or filmic image, and there's a similar frame too on our narration of certain things. Like there's so much that doesn't get told in that, and that stuff can be implied, or it can be so deeply left out that we aren't even aware of it's present somewhere in the background. And I think that that has to do with part of how I'm thinking about climate change. When we're not thinking about it, are we still feeling any of the pressure of it on us? Are we feeling the pressure of the environment even when we seem to be in an entirely built space? And what kind of an environment is an entirely built space? But in the opening, it really comes into view with the opening scene where we're meeting Cassie Carter, but we're meeting her through a viral video that's being shown to the novel's other protagonists, where she's having a meltdown in a drugstore because she's being followed by paparazzi while she shoplifts something minor, totally minor, a big deal. And I like that too, because I think both in my youth, because I grew up at the same time as, Lindsay Lohan. I'm the same number age as Lindsay Lohan, so I'm always wondering how am I doing and how's she doing. But I would watch these videos displayed of these famous females having meltdowns, and they were presented to me in a certain light. And as I kept watching it, I thought, like, what am I really seeing here? So we get one sort of very shallow impression of Cassie, and then the rest of the book is about seeing around that and recontextualizing that first idea of her as a spoiled and uncontrolled person.
In the play's visual life, and Dr. Wright's American Beach House specifically, it feels so about who's watching. And of course, these characters they're on a roof for the entirety of the play, and so it's sort of they're quite literally elevated, right? And we get the sense that it's the only place they can't be seen by others, but of course we're watching them, which the play feels, at least in writing, it feels like a self-conscious part of it, that we are watching them in this private space. And then in this intensely visual experience that we get secondhand in the play of this sexual encounter that we hear about, of course, that feels about us watching somebody who's being performed for, and that we're getting all kinds of levels of viewership there, right? Where we're watching somebody tell this story about this intense sexual encounter they had with somebody else that really is about the person they're performing this story for, right? So the characters in Dr. Wright, at least to me, feel self-consciously built to perform themselves for each other in a world where normally they cannot. So we get this chance to see them in their most unrestrained place. And so it is like the visual life of it feels so about who gets to do the visualizing.
Yeah, I think in my case, the visual aspect really came into focus thinking about how much the book is really exploring what is invisible, because the main character is struggling with chronic pain, and that's not something that you can see when you look at her. You don't know what she's dealing with, right? And it's all about how she communicates that. That's what we see, and it's something that I've talked about before, but I think it's so interesting. She's such an interior character, she's sort of, and I said this yesterday, but I imagine her in her first person talking to this imaginary audience, right? Because nobody in her actual life who's looking at her believes her, believes her reality. But in order to communicate her pain, she has to perform it to some degree. And I was thinking about that. We all have to do that to some degree in order to communicate pain that's invisible. Like just the nature of that kind of pain makes it so that you kind of have to shift your body around or, touch like a part of yourself. You are performing it. And by virtue of performing it, and this would happen to me as somebody who's dealt with chronic pain, I would second guess myself in the act of performing because I'd enhanced it for that person in order to communicate it. So it suddenly didn't seem real or authentic anymore. So it was that's what I was really, really interested in, that the truth is inside. In order to make the truth visible, you have to perform. But then by virtue of performing, it kind of feels like you've turned the truth into a lie somehow. So I was really interested in that.
Yeah, I related to that, like the drama queen idea, right, is sort of suggests the person who like feels too much or is like expressing too much feeling. And I see that a lot in All's Well, this kind of question of like, is she, is her behavior excessive? But then there's also the sort of opposite end of that, which I think we see with Kasia, of like, she's almost flat and kind of not delivering the affect that people want to see from her. And I think I kind of see that dynamic in all of your works in interesting ways as being sort of stuck between, on the one hand, this idea of like flatness and unfeeling and not kind of either expressing feeling enough or actually not feeling enough, versus the idea of like, but women feel too much and their feelings are too big and too messy. And so I wonder if you had thoughts on that kind of like the appropriate scale of emotion and how that shows up in your work. Alex, you want to go for it? We can like bop around this
that really resonates with me just because I think one thing that I feel a lot in watching the way women are described in media is that there's this dangerous quality to withholding the performance that is seen as threatening and which is sort of aggressively read as, again, out of control, unfeeling, out of touch. Otherwise, it's a dehumanizing reading of that. And so I think one of my main goals in depicting Kasia was to show her moving between these moments where she is giving the performance and she's inhabiting the space and the sort of psychological cost that is to accept that plasticity and to embody like a desire and character that have really not much to do with her as a person. Sort of like when you operate like a paperclip too many times and it loses some of that flexibility for which it is known. And at the same time, to show these excesses, first, like there is a theatricality, like a spectacle of the excess that I know that I, as a writer, was interested in writing. And I enjoyed writing it. I felt like I was cutting loose a little bit when she does act out. But the acting out is also in proportion to the frustration of having so much extracted from her over a long period of time. And I think I wanted to take those moments and place them into a new context and show sort of an economy of like depletion and constant output and constant desirability, and what that might feel like as a person experiencing it.
Just that flatness that you were talking about, I think that's something that Miranda experiences too, because she sees how her attempts to communicate her pain, she sees how they're met, and she sees that people don't believe her. And it's the most authentic way that she can come up with. And it's also just, it's so strange to try to communicate pain. It's very, very difficult, you know? I mean, the book is really interested, and I was really interested in kind of capturing almost the absurdity of it, you know, the kind of grasping at language that you have to do. There's like, she says that, like, you know, her hip feels red, you know, and that it's throbbing, that there's a chair on her foot, you know. And then, you know, when the physical therapist is repeating it, red, throbbing, a chair, it just starts to feel like absurd, you know. But it's like, it's the closest she can come to expressing it. So when she's kind of met with this sort of, you know, non-response, skepticism, whatever it is, just that kind of diminishing response, not acknowledging the reality of this person's experience, I think she just ends up shutting down, and she does kind of become silent and flat at times, because she just knows, she plays it out in her head, the possibilities, what she's encountered before, and she just decides, no, I'm just going to stay silent. And that's why, again, the book is so interior and so intense in its interiority, is because that's the place where she can express herself freely, you know, to the reader, basically.
I felt like acutely aware of the kind of push towards flatness, but also at the same time, I think as I was working on these essays, I was holding like on the sticky note in my forehead, like this refrain that we need to have a conversation about mental health. We need to talk about our feelings. We need to discuss them, and how often we heard it, hear it. And I think the essays in and of themselves were kind of like my attempt at that. I don't know if I necessarily by the end of it had any solutions like this is how we have that conversation. It's certainly how I had that conversation on the page, and kind of my resistance to that kind of flattening of affect or feeling. I guess the essays kind of speak to that in those experiences. And I think that's something that, like, the irony of that there's constantly this idea the need to talk about these things, but then at the same time to do so in a way that's acceptable, or filtered in a particular way. It's kind of interesting.
There's such a historical incentive to suppress the expression of suffering, right? So, like, especially for the non-dominant class, whatever that is, right? So there we come from a legacy of a really strong notion that our expression or performance of pain is unattractive and hysterical, and that has a real, you know, capitalist benefit, right? To stop that expression. And I love this topic so much because I just have so many questions about, like, when we say, like, when we say performative, I think we so often mean expressive and vice versa. And both of those things, do we really mean feminine? And, like, I think so often we see femininity as a performance, which does not feel contrary to masculinity, which it should be. Of course, like, standard masculinity is just as performative, but we never see it that way. We see femininity as a performance of a gender. And I think the same is true in so many different ways that we imagine that, like, there's an educated cis white hetero able-bodied neurotypical presentation of masculinity that is, you know, again, neutral, and that anything that isn't that is somehow a performance, right? And so I think that, I mean, I just have so many questions about how to deal with that. Fictionally and IRL.
I think I have time for one more question before we can open it up to the audience asking something perhaps. So my final question is that I wanted to ask you about like realism versus kind of fantasy or invention in that I think that we kind of tend to think about art in predominantly realist terms. So even if there is a kind of, even if we are inventing something else or creating other spaces, it's ultimately in the service of like, so that we learn something else about our reality. Like we kind of always come back to that. But I wonder if you have feelings about like, maybe there's something to be said for just like making shit up or inventing other things, or like maybe sometimes we aren't just talking about our world and that's good too.
I have something to say about that. I do. Well, it's funny because, so mine's an essay collection, it's nonfiction, but for me, like, I love the idea of escape and immersion, and I mean, for me, like watching horror movies, it's a form of escape. It's a form of just being immersed in this totally horrible hellscape where, I mean, perhaps we don't know each other well, but I'm a fairly nice person. It's probably a little bit of a surprise to find out that I do enjoy these films quite a bit. But I think too, like for me, when writing these essays, there was this really, something that was exciting, even though some of the material was tough, was this sense that I could conjure escape or kind of try and mesmerize with language or some other, I could lean into something else that wasn't exactly just, here's this sad thing that happened, here's this bad thing that happened. And so even though I was writing nonfiction, there was certainly a sense of conjuring, a sense of escape that I wanted to get into, because that's what movies are to me in some capacity. And sometimes they do reflect the world we live in, but sometimes they're so far away from this that even if they're speaking truths to our world and our days, I like the daydream. I like being able to escape and come back. I love escape.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. Like I think that I view all literature as being some sort of evocation of reality, and in some ways, when I am inventing the most, when I'm writing, is when I feel the most in touch with the particulars of reality. Like I also come from a background in cognitive science. I was really interested in body cognition and have the view that the brain is made by the world and we carry a piece of the world around with it. And so there's no sort of fantasy that's ever divorced from those things, and all of our most far-flung science fiction tales of other worlds, like I feel like you have to squint to not see the things in our surroundings that they're based on, you know. In relation to writing though, like I think that it is really fun, even when you are writing about a world that's supposed to be quite similar to ours, to slip in little errors, and that's where I really have a good time, like making up TV shows, making up episodes, making up products that aren't the focus, but sound a little bit off. And I love it when every once in a while, like I'll have a translator writing to me and saying, in your book, you reference The Night of the Undead Dead. We can't find this movie. I'm like, that's right. We can find it.
That's so funny because I have like the opposite take that means the same thing, which is like which is that like I find all writing and in terms of what I feel when I'm doing it, like the hypernaturalism of it, when it is hypernatural, that it is fantastical, right? That like all writing is fantasy, which is the same thing as saying that it's not. I that makes sense to me. I'm sorry that I said it out loud though. So I get really excited about composing a planet that feels so hyper specific as to be such a personal fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I sort of feel the same way as you do. At that idea that Alex was talking about fantasy sort of revealing us. I've always felt like fantasy. I step into fantasy and I step away from what I think of as reality, even psychological reality. There's when I give myself permission to do that on the page, it starts to really feel even more true. And it captures more than, it has room for some reason to capture more of the truth than I'm able to capture, even in fiction, with like a more realistic moment. And that's what I love the most about fantasy, and why I always return to it, is because there's something really true there that just I feel like can't quite be expressed, at least by me, in realist fiction.
Invite our audience. Yeah.
Hi. So this question specifically for Mona, but I feel like it could also apply to anyone. I was just thinking, because of your work, all of your works, that in dealing with pain, I think it's very easy sometimes for pain to be the narrative and the thing that defines your experiences, and ultimately like the thing that defines you as a person. And in dealing with that feeling and writing about your pain, and when pain does become the narrative, how are you able to shift the narrative from that, or deal with that complexity? And in what ways does writing about pain help with your healing process?
It's a great question. Thank you so much. I think for me, and just being more candid, pain tends to be the place where I write from. So I'll when I get the most inspired is when I'm experiencing a moment of real powerlessness. Like that stays with me. And I won't have any ways of getting out of it right then. Right then it's just powerlessness, pain. But later, creativity, fantasy, they come in and they allow me to claim a kind of agency and have freedom and power with an experience that I felt powerlessness with, and so I think for me it's creativity that kind of gets me out of a pain narrative of powerlessness, and then puts me in a position of play and power and fun and connection with other people who have had a similar experience of that pain. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know if anyone, I know Gina, I know your writing also deals with this question in a lot of ways as well, but.
I think it's really, what's interesting to me is like, I think that a lot of the things, like one thing for me that like I kind of, especially with this book, found is that you can kind of play your cards in a very particular way. And I didn't think that was possible when you're writing about some of the things that I wrote about. And one way it kind of helps me writing through the pain or writing to the pain, writing about some of those experiences was making that choice. And there were definitely things that I wrote about and cut out from the book, very specific details that I cut out from the book. And I think that for me was helpful, like the act of not writing them out, but actually making the choice that I could decide what to share or not to share, and kind of write around certain scenes or experiences. I don't know if it helped or healed, but there was something about it that felt meaningful to me. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. It felt meaningful.
Liza, did either of you want to say anything about that as well, or just in case?
That's great to listen.
Yeah.
Yeah, so throughout the discussion, there was kind of going back to it, there was that talking about how, charisma and authenticity can be important for accepting reality. But there was also that discussion of revealing the unlikable facets of yourself, and kind of how living impulsive can be beautiful, which I agree with at times. But do you think it's, because they're two kind of complicated ideas and kind of different in a way. So, and this is kind of for everybody. Do you think it's better to be nuanced and absurd, or as real as possible in respect, but in respect to kind of tie into this main idea of this discussion, in respect to those voices that we don't typically hear from, especially the kind of female identifying voice?
I have an immediate thought. There's so much to this question which is so like delightful and like delicious to think about. But I'm having this immediate feeling, which is that there's little that I find more absurd or funnier than people taking mundane things seriously. And that the absurdity of where we spend our attention and focus, and even the absurdity of how we choose to avoid harm or choose to try to be liked is so ridiculous as to be, both things at the same time, which is nuanced and naturalistic and also hyperbolic and absurd.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this incredible scene. I don't know if anybody watches Femme 15. There's this great scene where the two girls in the show, they're 13-year-old girls, but they're played by 30-year-old actors. They're like each having their own kind of really sad romance moment with their respective partners. And it's like intense. It's so intense, and we're really close up to it. And then all the camera has to do is pull back. And the minute it pulls back and you see them in a larger frame, your heart just melts and you laugh, right? And you actually see the whole context. And I didn't realize to what extent that perspective shift is such a huge part of humor, and it's such a huge part of having empathy, and I think just talking about the absurd, when I'm going through a moment of pain that's very, very real, or I'm experiencing that powerlessness, if I pull back later on, that's where I can start to laugh, and have other feelings about it. And I think that's really, really important to sort of capturing the truth of the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that we need all of it, because I think that what comes from writing from an under-depicted perspective, whether it's in terms of gender or race or also class, is that the genre conventions of writing from that place feel especially narrow and especially palpable. So just to yank that open in every way that you can, I think, is all broadening the field of that perspective, and making it clear that there is so much room to move around in and navigate within it. The other thing I often think is that some of these things are realistic from one distance and absurd from another, depending on where you place the camera, again, as Mona was talking about. I think sometimes about, I wrote a piece that was sort of designed as a monologue called Woman Time, and it's someone talking about, like, when I was a woman, it was like this, but they're getting a lot of things wrong. But they've just been displaced a little bit, so that the narrator talks about every day shaving their eyelashes off so they were ready to go out to work. It's just a slight spatial change, but it seems horrific. But that's all a matter of normalization and convention, right?
I love that. Like, it's an idea of normalization and convention, but also this idea of, like, expanding the lens through which we're seeing things, pulling back, shifting the camera. It also can, I think, make for a much more potentially cinematic experience for the writer who's experiencing, putting this on the page, but also for your readers and your audience. And I think that's something to consider too, is how can I shift perspective? How can I widen and make this more cinematic and just vaster and larger? Not necessarily, I'm not thinking of this exclusively from an image perspective, but also from a thought perspective too. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question kind of, I guess, more specifically for Liza, but if there's something else to say about that. Because obviously you were talking earlier about this idea of like performing femininity, and I was just wondering, like, particularly when you're writing like a play that is going to be performed by the actors, or in terms of just writing something that's going to be perceived by other people that you don't know, how do you like struggle with what is actually like genuine and what is performed to be interpreted as more genuine? Like this concept that like maybe you understand but you're worried other people won't, and you have to kind of translate it from your mind. Like how do you do that? I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I think, yeah, that is tough. I like that. I feel like, I guess I'm starting from a place of not being sure what genuine means. And that I think when I'm writing for actors to perform things, I'm never thinking about their level of performativeness with any given part, right? Even if the part is meant to be, oh, this character is literally performing their high school musical number for another character. I'm not like, oh, this is a particularly heightened moment. I regard it all with the exact same amount of seriousness, which I think maybe hopefully lends its absurdity. And I feel like the way that I write them is, even if it seems frantic or at different levels of performativeness, is really reflective of how I hear the world, especially when I get to overhear people talk about things that that I'm not always privy to. So like to overhear conversations somewhere is always like the best gift. The tiny mistakes in communication that only you can catch as an outsider, right? That you can hear two people misunderstand each other, or two people desperate to connect. And you, as a person not involved in the situation, often can be the one to be like, they missed, right? And so I find that how I try to compose these planets that I make is often reflective of how the world sounds to me, which is really absurd. And also I'm really interested in the question that people try to avoid in the theater and probably in their fiction a lot, which is like the terrible discomfort of like, is this on purpose? Which I got so much of as like a child of community theater, where it's like, did the butcher paper set fall as an effect or is it broken? And as an adult, I'm like, I love asking, and I try not to shy away from that in composing people's words or the worlds in which we find them. So hopefully that answered that.
I think we are actually out of time, but I want to thank you all so much for such fascinating responses and a wonderful conversation.
And thank you to Kasia for wonderfully moderating. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience and asking great questions. Please come back at 5 for a reading that will include Alexandra Kleeman, Lauren Euler, and Jen Chaplin. So please return for that. And then we have our finale of the of the festival, which is the staged reading of Liza's play, Dr. Ride's American Beach House. So you'll come down to the Cherry. There's a suggested donation of $5 for Ithaca connected folks and 10 for non, which will help support the Cherry. But we'll see you there either way. Thanks.
I don't know the